So our next presenter is Noah MacDonald on Indian Day Schools towards Jesuit and Anishinaabe reconciliation along the shores of Gichigami. Welcome. I hope I pronounced it right.
Alrighty. Anin, Buzu, Misquaganu Indigenous Mayangan and Dodum, Mishmakatan Dunjaba. Thank you all so much for listening to me here today, and thank you for the presentations that were given so far. What I just said to you in my language, Anishinaabe Moan, I introduced myself and the name I was given in ceremony. I introduced my clan and where I'm from, my community, Mishmakatan First Nation. This topic that I'm covering, it's a bit of a difficult one. And it's one that we have in Canada have began to reconcile and have, made some really big leaps in some ways, but there's still more work to be done. But it's also an area in which case Americans and Native Americans and Indigenous folks in the States are just beginning on right now. So I thought it might be a good time to, and a good place to kind of share that, especially since we're also on, being Anishinaabe, our traditional territory all together around the Great Lakes area. So essentially, this project kind of started when I was researching my own family's history. History that there's not much written about. It's kind of stories and fractured stories. And so I thought, okay, I'll dig into some old archives and try and understand more about my community. And as I was doing that, I found evidence of day schools and also Jesuit administered day schools in my own community, Mishmakatan, kind of run as well as neighboring communities of Batchewana First Nation and Garden River. It's interesting because I'm an Anishinaabe Catholic, and my faith is inherently linked to the Jesuits, and same with my ancestors. It was the Jesuits who introduced Christianity to the Anishinaabe. It was relationships that were formed that made it part of our own culture in certain parts of the community, and it is one in which I have a deep personal relationship, which is why I think it's important to challenge these things. It is one that's built on friendship. And it requires asking tough questions and seeking reconciliation. So essentially, I thought that this is a good opportunity to address some of this emerging research around Indian day schools, which in many ways are very similar to residential schools and things that have been covered so far in boarding schools that have been covered so far. So essentially, one of the gifts of the Jesuits to the Anishinaabe was an openness to enculturation. One in which case we, through different relationships and over time, especially after Vatican II, really encouraged and embraced Anishinaabe worldviews and spirituality to incorporate that in, especially into the liturgy, into our it was a gift that the Jesuits made possible for us. But at this time of reconciliation, I think that enculturation, it doesn't always just go one way. I think that there's a gift of viewing it more as something reciprocal. And so to guide this process of reconciliation and to inspire it, I think that enculturating Anishinaabe worldviews, particularly the seven grandfather teachings, is a good place to start and a guide that can offer the Jesuits and the Anishinaabe back towards a place of reconciliation. So the relation, and by the way, I apologize, I'm going to be skipping over a few things. This is a really complex and deep history. It spans 400 years. And so I've, for the sake of time, I've had to cut about 5,000 words. So so there's just a few things to start off with, knowing that the Anishinaabe and Jesuit relationship is something that's very sacred to both parties. Knowing that the Indian day school system was ultimately a system of genocide and of assimilation that was imposed by the Crown and had the complicity of religious orders and churches. And ultimately that the seven grandfather teachings are a deeply Anishinaabe theology. It was something that was gifted to us. So keeping that in mind, there's a few aspects that might be a little jumped over just for the sake of brevity. So the relational history of the Society of Jesus and the Anishinaabe of Lake Superior spans nearly 400 years. with its beginnings largely chronicled in the Jesuit relations. First contact came in 1641, followed by longer missionary activity with Claude Delbon, Claude Eloise, and the namesake of this very institution, Jacques Marquette. After introducing Christianity to the Anishinaabe of the region, the Jesuits took a nearly 150-year hiatus from the area. The post-suppression returned to Bawating, which is, if you've ever heard of Sault Ste. Marie, that's the area that the Anishinaabe call Bawating. It's the place of the rapids. It's also a meeting place. So there's going to be another few words I'll use: Sault Ste. Marie, Bawating, the North Shore of Lake Superior, all the same area. So they returned in 1848 with the arrival of the beloved Father August Kohler. Kohler's legacy is marked by the missions he established and the loving reciprocity he shared with the Anishinaabe. Carl Helly, a renowned historian and member of Garden River First Nation, writes fondly of the cleric, stating Kohler's efforts to protect Anishinaabe rights, tend to the ill, and administer to the spiritual needs of the community earned this priest the name Gasanagid Eshikang, which means the inspirer. Kohler established Garden River's Immaculate Heart of Mary Parish in 1852 to serve as the center of the Sault Ste. Marie mission, where the superior would oversee various missionary outposts. The mission consisted of 6 parishes along the northeastern coast of Lake Superior, serving the Indigenous Catholics of Garden River, Batchewana, and Mishmacotton First Nation. The relationship between the Jesuits and the Anishinaabe at this time is one that embodied reciprocity and friendship, the transcendent tethering of peoples and spirit. Though, by 1867, the imposition of a third party in the form of a newly confederated Canada inserted itself, reshaping the landscape of settler-Indigenous relations, with direct impacts on the roles missionaries were to play in First Nation communities, being relied upon heavily for efforts of nation-building guised as evangelization. Both parties, church and state, came to recognize mutual benefit from a closer collaboration, particularly between religious orders and the Federal Department of Indian Affairs, as partnerships would guarantee some extent of funding necessary to operate and expanding their missions, with the additional benefit of often being granted powers beyond their ecclesiastical faculties. The Crown benefited from the human and relational infrastructure of the churches in First Nations, exploiting friendships as a tool of assimilation, dismantlement, and ultimately erasure. Jesuit involvement in federal Indian education. The Jesuits' legacy of Indigenous education has largely been shaped by the notoriety of activities in and around Lake Huron's Manitoulin Island region, as they operated day school in Wikwemekong before embracing the residential school model and relocating to Spanish Ontario. From 1913 to 1958, the Society of Jesus administered St. Peter Calver and St. Charles Grenier School for Boys, recognized as the only residential school they ran. It is also recognized as the darkest chapter of the history of the Jesuits of Canada, one that they have dedicated themselves toward reconciling. The Jesuits' residential school efforts have been extensively written about by survivors and researchers alike. However, it appears that other Jesuit endeavors in Indigenous schooling have been overlooked in the shadow of Spanish, as is the case with the Indian Day schools of the Sault Ste. Marie Mission, Garden River, Batchewana, and Mishmacotton First Nations. In addition to archived internal correspondence and mission diaries held by the Society of Jesus, evidence of Jesuit involvement in federal Indian Day schools can be found within the annual report of the Department of Indian Affairs, submitted to the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs to the Governor General of the Dominion of Canada. These yearly reports detail the department's policies, programs, and initiatives aimed at managing various aspects of Indigenous people under the Indian Act. From 1879 to 1913, in the section of the report outlining Indian Day schools operated in Canada, the name of Jesuit priests are listed as the administrators of Garden River Roman Catholic Indian Day School. Records of day schools erected to serve Batchewana First Nation and Mishmacotton also contain evidence of a Jesuit administration overseeing lay teaching staff. As documented by various ministers of Indian Affairs, the chronological order of the Jesuit principles of Garden River is as follows: Reverend Thomas Ouellette, Reverend G.A. Artis, Reverend P.E. Lamarche, Reverend H. Canon, and Reverend J.A. Drollett, and Reverend Renowned. Now, these names I'm listing here, it's not meant as any sort of personal implication in any wrongdoing. This is just to indicate that there is a strong these are listed as paid employees of the state. These are showing a Jesuit cooperation that is deeply involved with the Indian Day School program. So individual reports from both the Indian Affairs and the Ministry of Education also offer valuable insights. Beginning with Ouellette, we see the Jesuit Day School as being celebrated, as stated in 1891 by Ministry Inspector, who states, "The school at Garden River is the most vigorous and successful Indian school in my division. Reverend Thomas Ouellette is in charge. The best evidence of its excellent management is the fact that the school is always largely attended." The Jesuits of English Canada's Dictionary of Biographies, along with other works published in Jesuit studies, document a history of assignments that illuminate an interesting pattern. Nearly all the aforementioned Jesuits associated with Garden River Roman Catholic Indian Day School would go on to be assigned to the Spanish residential school. In the case of Artis, following his time at Garden River, he would also later be appointed the principal of the Spanish residential school. This all occurred despite his known problematic attitude towards Indigenous peoples. As his biographers wrote, Artis exhibited a certain rigidity and lack of sensitivity to the Indian people regarding what he considered to be their failures to meet Christian moral standards and religious practice. The problem with day schools, the extensive network of Jesuit primary, secondary, and post-secondary schools across the world reflects the value of the Society of Jesus holds for accessible and quality education, for which they remain leaders to this day, particularly in North America. However, it must be stated that there is a radical difference between what we recognize as education and what the Indian residential and day school system truly was. The Finis Operis was not fundamental human development, but rather federally mandated assimilation. While these institutions mirrored ordinary schools at times, and authentic learning may have taken place, they were fundamentally tools of genocide and should be recognized as such. Anishinaabe scholar Jackson Pine of Trent University has devoted much of his academic career to researching the history and impacts of Indian day schools. His insights illuminate just how troubling these schools and policies that informed them were. Pine describes Indian day schools as racially segregated educational institutions with the purpose of assimilating Indigenous children into settler society through the eradication of their cultural practices, languages, and traditions. The Indian Act and its amendments made it compulsory for Indigenous children to attend, with absentees facing the threat of removal from their parents' custody by the Indian agent. The Western curriculum and religious education were taught with the intention of homogenizing Eurocentric norms and the value for eventual social integration. Chronic underfunding and poor hiring practices made these schools high-risk environments for students, with astonishing rates of abuse, disease, and illness-related death. The Jesuits, by mere virtue of involvement with Indian day schools, bear both the complicity and culpability in the systematic harms caused. Harms left unrecognized by eroded friendship, as the Jesuits have slowly ceased all ministry in the area and have been absent from Bawatang region for decades. Imagining shared futures. This is the statement of reconciliation that was written in 2013 by the Jesuits of Canada to the survivors of Spanish residential school. And it acts as an important model not only of reconciliation, but also of the commitment that they hold and one that and a starting point for them. Now, grappling with the complex history of this evidence, indicating intimate involvement with the Indian day school system, the Jesuits of Canada find themselves in a unique position of discerning action or inaction. In recent years, the religious order's efforts to reconcile with Indigenous peoples has become a fundamental aspect of their charism and mission in Canada. The institutional championing of this cause, in many ways, made them a model to the rest of the Church. Though this approach came after years of legal battles with residential school survivors, public outcry for past atrocities, and being named a liable party to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's mandate. Reconciliation of this sort had never truly been on the Jesuits' own volition. As reckoning with the Indian day school system grows in momentum, the Jesuits have an opportunity to be the ones who take the first step, initiating justice rather than waiting to have justice initiated upon them. Perhaps when imagining how to proceed, the Jesuits can apply an Ignatian approach that continues to produce faithful and long-lasting relationships with Indigenous people on Manitoulin Island, the approach of enculturation. It can take place beyond the liturgy and inform steps by centering Anishinaabe knowledge aided by theological reflection to foster relations that must take place. In this spirit, we can imagine a step-by-step approach towards reconciliation centered around the 7 grandfather teachings. Proposed enculturation approach guided by the 7 grandfather teachings, as the late Edward Benton Benet, Grand Chief of the Three Fires Midewin Lodge, identifies the 7 grandfather teachings as bravery, humility, wisdom, honesty, truth, respect, and love. These teachings, imparted both supernaturally and ancestrally, inform all aspects of Anishinaabe life on our path towards Minnow-Bimadzawin. Additionally, it may too offer a path towards reconciliation between the Jesuits and the Anishinaabe of Garden River, Batchewana, and Mishmagotten First Nation. First is bravery. Bravery is to face the foe with integrity. In the case of the Jesuits, their foe is not the Anishinaabe people, but rather a difficult and largely forgotten history that they ought to confront with integrity. It would be far easier for the Society of Jesus to look the other way and not dig into their own past involvement in the Indian day school system. It is possible that if they don't bring this information to light, they may never have to face accountability. The stone has gone unturned for over a century. The temptation of silence is indeed grave, as addressing the issue bears significant risks for the Jesuits, including financial liability, public scandal, and a black mark on their legacy. To give into these fears and turn a blind eye would be a reaction of cowardice, whereas proceeding in spite of them manifests bravery and responsive, rooted in integrity. Confronting troubling histories is guaranteed to take a toll on all parties, but is vital to remain steadfast in their pursuit that is both transparent and critical. Michael Stoger, influenced by Lonergan and his deep connection to the Anishinaabe, described the difficult but important task of facing historical Indigenous Catholic relations, claiming that the work of critical evaluation it draws us into the realm of discernment, decision, and action on behalf of justice and liberation. Stoger continues by expressing his hopes that undertakings of this nature will contribute to a greater solidarity with Aboriginal peoples and their struggles to revitalize their cultures. Humility. Humility is to know yourself as a sacred part of creation. In recognizing our own sacredness, we recognize the sacredness of others, equally possessed by all, which instills responsibility to one another. By merely participating in the Indian day school system, the Jesuits failed their responsibility to the Anishinaabe people, as subjecting children to assimilation corrupts their ability to recognize their sacredness. Assimilation is cursed with the sin of pride, as its impositions of the dominant result in denigration of the minority. However, it is through humility that restoration can occur. Apology can be an important step to begin, and likely the important place to end. Expressing remorse humbles the transgressor before the transgressed. It acknowledges that one's sacredness was not recognized, and the past affirms the shining presence of the sacredness today. Honesty. Honesty in facing the situation is to be brave. In many ways, since the beginning of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Jesuits of Canada have demonstrated an exemplary commitment to honesty and reconciliation thus far. In many ways, it was marked by, they also kind of took another step further that wasn't called upon them, and that was to release the name of all the Jesuits that were accused of sexual abuse, and this happened in 2023. It marks a pattern of going above and beyond what is mandated of them. And also, a scary part of that is that over a third of those Jesuits that were named across Canada had worked at Spanish and worked with Indigenous folks. But it also shows an important step in commitment to truth and transparency and going above and beyond. Wisdom. To cherish knowledge is to know wisdom. This process can only bring true healing if Anishinaabe knowledge is centered in all courses of action, as what is stripped away in the past must be radically cherished in the present for restoration to occur. The Jesuits ought to let the journey be informed by elders who know how to best serve their community, accompanying and accommodating them along the way. Indigenous theologian, Sister Eva Solomon, describes the profound gifts elders and traditional knowledge offers community in discernment by stating, by acknowledging and honoring our Anishinaabe worldview, our sense of self-worth is transformed, and new possibilities are manifested. In righting past wrongs and restoring these relationships, much joy can come from these newly manifested possibilities described by Solomon. Respect. To honor all of creation is to have respect. We see that respect is inseparable from honor. These teachings bear significant value in the context of Jesuit reconciliation, as it cements a duty not only to listen to stories of survivors and their descendants, but to honor those stories. Relying solely on documents found in the archives and journals negates the living history that embodies the authentic legacy of Indian day schools, demonstrating an impact that is truly intergenerational. Describing these lessons learned and from listening to survivors of Spanish in the past, former provincial Peter Brisson states, "We put our own financial reputational interests before those of the victims and did not really listen to what they had to say. We began to realize that we were treating old friends like they were enemies. Because of this realization, we started listening attentively to stories of survivors. Admitting the truths led us to admit responsibility for the harmful actions of our brothers and seek to heal the damage of the victims. Respecting the survivors means honoring their stories, and truly moving forward cannot take place unless what is known, moving forward together cannot take place unless you have known where you have been together. To know love is to know peace. In the efforts of colonization and assimilation is undeniably upheaved by peace. Assimilation has upended peace in Indigenous communities, replaced by volatility inherent to trauma. There exists a responsibility to remedy this transgression through restorative justice among all complicit actors, including the Jesuits. Discerning this, I'm going to jump ahead. Essentially, perhaps a commitment to restorative justice may help Jesuits and Anishinaabe to know peace together, so they can ultimately know love together. Truth is to know all of these things. Simply put, when the Jesuits wish to reapproach truth and reconciliation, the path to the latter is embodied by the former. And finally, there's the word niji in Anishinaabe means both friendship and kinship. The same word for friend is the same word for brother. And it's an important place to, you could stop being friends, but you can never stop being kin. And so this tethered history of the Jesuits and Anishinaabe of Gichigami, spanning nearly 400 years. Today, however, this tether is fraying and in need of repair. If there is hope to honor this connection, perhaps enculturating these difficult tasks and remembering shared histories will produce opportunities for imagining shared futures. Futures where the Society of Jesus and the Anishinaabe, in the words of the Jesuit Statement on Reconciliation, may come once again to call each other friend. Miigwech.
Thank you so much. So maybe have some question.
Well, thank you, Noah. As a Jesuit, these are difficult questions, and the burden of our past is something we have to reckon with. In this case, in the case of Georgetown University as well. But the only way is through truth. Yeah. And thank you for that. I do have this observation. It was just occurring to me. Let's say the school system, mandatory elementary and secondary school systems in Canada and the U.S., for immigrants coming in with a different language and a different culture also were kind of, it was a sluice into mainstream society. However, those people came of their own choice to a land that was, well, not theirs. And in back of that is the sovereignty of the First Nations and Native Americans. And I wonder if you could say something about this, the sense of sovereignty involved in any of this?
Yeah. Absolutely. The purpose, the ultimate purpose of Indian day schools and the residential school system had to do with the Indian Act. It was all the treaties that had led up to the Confederation of Canada, in which case they had to write an act to meet all those responsibilities in order to, honor the crown, the restoring and keeping the crown's honor. And so this was a way to circumvent the treaties by forcing students, forcing Indigenous folks into programs like this would help integrate them into society. So that way, it wasn't to make us all one homogenous, melting pot. It was to reduce the fiduciary responsibility to treaties. So they thought, the architects thought that within, 20, 30 years, there would be no treaty responsibility. Everyone would be integrated. So it was ultimately, this all comes down to cost savings, which is terrible. But at the same time, it's there are really great stories and places I've explored where, especially the first day schools around in Wemacom, before Canada was a country, before a lot of this influence of superiority and nation building came in, they were taught in Anishinaabe. They were taught with Jesuits and Indigenous folks from the community. It was something that embodied something that was welcomed and done in a really good way. That that respected the self-determination and sovereignty of a nation to welcome in education rather than having it imposed.
So thank you very much for your presentation. I wrestle with the same question I want to pose that to you. Within the context of Africa, that I have argued that coloniality of imagination, the first victim of it is the colonizer, not the colonized. The colonized is the secondary victim. And that said, where I'm going with that is that the colonizer has already been dehumanized in their psyche of not being able to see the fullness of the human. If we hold that, it has allowed me to soften my critique of the missionaries in Africa, in the sense that could they have been able to do otherwise, especially within the very large framework of the state and the power of the state. They were working within this framework to evangelize these people. They were not creating a state. And this large framework is already a machine of dehumanization. And so, whether they like it or not, but for example, Bartolomé de las Casas is a good example. He was trying to navigate this tension. Okay, I want to be humane towards the indigenous people, but still, there's so much I can do, or else I can then be accused of treason to the state and be killed by the state. So that said, I don't know how you guys wrestle with that also, because it is what helped me, because I used to say, okay, why didn't the missionaries just abandon the British and do their own thing? The British can just put the barrel of the gun and kick all of them out. But because of the quest for evangelization, that was the primary motive of the missionary. But the missionary cannot evangelize in a neutral land because that land has been claimed by a secular political power. So I don't know. I just wanted to bring that up.
There's two, essentially, in many ways, residential schools and day schools kind of serve two masters. One, both the church and the state. And so the state had very real reasons for wanting to essentially eliminate a culture, a people, and to build a nation off those backs. Whereas the church, in many ways, wanted to evangelize. As even if the theological interpretations they may have now, we wouldn't necessarily hold it the same way, or we could critique that. But there was to say that everyone had bad will going into it, I wouldn't say that for sure. But, just as our conversation we had a little bit earlier around Lonergan, do we hold individuals accountable in the past, or should we really focus on holding institutions accountable? And so holding the Jesuit leadership at the time, or holding the Jesuits or other religious orders or other actors, even the government of Canada now, to hold those folks accountable for what happened, not focusing on individuals and own intentions, because the harms, it reduces the impact. So I think that that's a good place to kind of reflect back on how. And context really is everything. It's very different in Canada, and it has a lot to do with capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, where missionaries and Canadians and everyone became really, really motivated by money and power within a new nation. In which case, in the past, where the Jesuits were staunchly opposed the government of British North America, or when it was still under the crown, still under England, trying to neglect Indigenous people's rights and trying to take away land, trying to take that, the reason why I mentioned briefly August Kohler, the reason he was so beloved was because he was instrumental in the 1850 Robinson Treaties, in which case he advocated for Indigenous folks to keep their land, told them, and would publish in newspapers and write to Parliament and doing all these things to say, this is wrong what you're doing. This is we need to respect sovereignty. And so there are really prior to this ramp up of economics and there was it's interesting to see all the factors that play into what drives things like this.
I currently, outside of school, do some work for a native school in South Dakota that was formerly a Jesuit boarding school. And one of the things that I've noticed, or I have experienced, I guess, is the difficulty in kind of reading between the lines of some of this history, given most of the records being of administrators or Jesuits, things like that, as opposed to maybe firsthand accounts of students or the parents of students. I'm wondering, in your research, whether it's related to this project or otherwise, what kind of records you've looked at and how you've had to navigate that as you try and uncover maybe a fuller history.
Absolutely. This really is in its infancy of research. Essentially, when I was going through family history, trying to kind of understand more, going through records, I saw things like this kind of coming up, in which case I then reached out to some Jesuits I know who said, have you ever heard of a day school, Jesuits operating day schools? They said, no, let me check with this person. And then they went up to the archivists. They said, no, I've never heard of this person. Went up to the lawyers. No, I've never heard of this. And then eventually made its way to the provincial, in which case kind of this is the process of all the Jesuits and kind of all coming to terms like, oh, this is something brand new to us. And that's why it's really an opportunity. And so the records that exist are really just public records available in reports of the Federal Department of Indian Affairs, as well as in some as well as diaries written by missionaries at the time of Jesuits. And so this is something that's very new, and that's why, especially don't want to, the sins aren't what of this isn't something that's what actually occurred. The sin is really just understanding that what this is a system that they were involved in that is in need of reconciliation, not necessarily on the actual actions, but in, again, looking more systemic and institutional responsibility rather than individuals and places. So I look forward to digging into and finding more about these processes. And the Jesuits have already, before I went forward to kind of propose this and write about and deliver this, I reached out to both my chief and to the Jesuit provincial to say, like, I want to go forward with this, but I also want to make sure that in going forward, dialogue is going to happen. And both are going to want to go further. So as much as this is developing, reconciliation is also developing with this being known. So yeah, very much.
Thank you so much on a moving presentation on Indian day schools.